I think we should start now. It's 1:15. Welcome everyone to today's seminar. Our guest, once again, is Professor Alesandra Ferare, whom I introduced to you yesterday. And yesterday, Professor Ferare gave a lecture on the renewal of democracy and the prospect of the renewal of democracy in the context of hyperpluralism. And the lecture was based broadly on Professor Ferare's latest book, The Democratic Horizon. So today, we are going to have a discussion with Professor Ferare on this same book, The Democratic Horizon, and we're going to go into some more detail regarding all those arguments that Professor Ferare presented yesterday. So we are having four speakers altogether here, myself included. Two of my colleagues from the Institute, Srđan and Bojana, and Jelena from the Faculty of Political Sciences, and we have the author as well, who is going to reflect on our own commentaries, and so I hope we'll have a lively discussion. So, without further ado, I would like to begin the discussion by a very brief reconstruction of Ferare's standpoint as it is developed in his book and as it has been presented yesterday. I know that all of you have had a chance to read the book or parts of it, but nevertheless, for those of you who might not have read it entirely, I will just briefly reconstruct the standpoint. So, as we might remember from yesterday, Alesandra Ferare's political liberalism presents a proposal as to how democracy could adapt and respond to what he considers to be the main inhospitable conditions that have emerged over the last couple of decades globally, which make it more and more difficult for democracy to thrive both in those societies which have had long traditions of democracy and pluralism and institutional parliamentary constitutionalism, as well as in those which are only aspiring to become democratic. And among these ever more inhospitable conditions are what Ferare calls hyperpluralism, which means a new stage of cultural pluralism within Western societies, which makes it ever more difficult for any kind of overlapping consensus to be reached on the constitutional essentials of society. Then various neo-oligarchic tendencies, which can be observed in the West as well, which fundamentally endanger the autonomy of politics and the autonomy of institutional procedures from the direction of the capital. And then also the acceleration of global time, which has the effects of putting pressure on every form of institution to verticalize, to delegate power to the leaders who make statements to the media, which makes it ever more difficult for deliberation and for kind of horizontal consultation. And then there is globalization in general, and the resurgence of market liberalism in its new formation, the neoliberal formation, which also, in a way, abolishes the most important advances, the most important progressive steps that have been taken over the course of the 20th century to tame capital in favor of justice and in favor of collective good. All these inhospitable conditions are a matter of serious concern, and Ferare's perspective suggests that John Rawls's later writings, primarily The Political Liberalism, present a viable framework for re-articulating and expanding the democratic project, but still a framework which has to be expanded further. Now, political liberalism, as it has been presented in Rawls's works, should be treated as the alternative to the more classical and conventional metaphysical or perfectionist liberalism, which is more generally known. And let me just briefly outline the difference. So, Metaphysical or perfectionist liberalism basically is epistemologically authoritarian in the sense that it requires us to accept the legitimacy of the fundamental liberal principles such as individual autonomy, procedural justice, normative universalism at face value, so without any questioning. And it calls for us to, in a way, impose liberalism on those who can be considered recalcitrant subjects, so those who do not subscribe to that comprehensive worldview at this point. In that sense, it's also imperialist, and it's also kind of Western-centric. So it also requires us to defend the value of pluralism on paradoxical grounds. Namely, perfectionist liberalism argues that there is only one possible way to defend pluralism, which is at odds with the very idea of pluralism. So what Ferare uses is the expression of liberal monopluralism. So we impose pluralism on others who do not want to subscribe to it. So current, political climate in the world is mostly characterized by two extremes: the extremes of perfectionist liberalism on the one hand, and the mere modus vivendi on the other hand, which can be also understood as the conventional multiculturalism. And neither of these two alternatives, according to Ferare, is favorable for responding to these above-mentioned inhospitable conditions. So political liberalism, as opposed to both of it tries to, in a way, strike a middle path, but not merely in a kind of a compromising way. It tries to articulate a genuine alternative on the grounds of what Ferare calls epistemic humility and a political conception of truth. So in contrast to perfectionist liberalism, epistemic humility means that we have no legitimacy to impose our comprehensive worldview, the liberal worldview, onto other cultural subjects, other ideological subjects, people who do not endorse liberalism at this point. We have no more legitimacy to do that than they have the legitimacy to impose their worldviews on us. That is why political liberalism, according to Ferare, is the only viable way. So political liberalism aims at providing new means of establishing an overlapping consensus in a situation where we don't all share the same starting premises when deliberating in the public sphere. And what do we do then when we share absolutely no common premises with certain other citizens of our polity? So we have to first of all take into account the autonomy of politics. So what we can't do is just bring into the deliberative realm certain conceptions of the good from the outside, as Ferare argues, from the realm of theory or the realm of morality, as conventionally understood, and then just impose this conception on other subjects in the deliberative arena. What we have to do is we have to reason our way towards the certain essentials which can then be institutionalized as constitutional essentials, certain normative essentials which we in the end all subscribe to. But even that is not really guaranteed, because if we share no premises to begin with, then we might even not be able to reason with others in public space in the standard way that we understand reasoning. We have to resort to certain innovative modes of reasoning, and Ferare here introduces a very interesting notion, the notion of conjectural reasoning, which is really kind of anti-metaphysical in the sense that you in no way try to convince others to subscribe to your foundational premises, but you start from the other's own perspective, and then you try to show the internal resources of that person's moral worldview that can be worked out in order to finally reach some kind of an overlapping consensus with that person. So Ferare mentions many examples. I have no time now to go into these, but it's a really interesting project, the idea of conjectural reasoning. So, but for that part, in order to be able to see the world through the eyes of others and kind of put ourselves in their perspective in order to reason conjecturally, we need the power of imagination. And that is something that the classical liberal conception and even classical deliberative conceptions don't really stress enough. That's why Alesandra Ferare introduces the idea that politics should actually be understood not only as the exercise of public reason with the aim of reaching an uncoerced overlapping consensus, but it is the exercise of public reason, which should be able to stimulate people's imagination, to awaken people's imagination, and in order to argue for certain collective ends of action which are not simultaneously pursuable with other collective ends of action that some other social actors might be willing to argue for. So politics at its best, this is the term that Ferare uses, liberal politics at its best, as opposed to standard politics, the everyday politics of harmonizing interests, of running the institutions, of holding the elections, of even arguing in the public space. As opposed to these normal politics, politics at its best means the weaving of vision into the texture of what is possible. Now, that is a very interesting definition, which means arguing, formulating good reasons that move the imagination in order to prioritize certain collective ends of social action that can be pursued simultaneously with certain other ends. And then Ferare argues that public space is not only the locus where we find the ways to accommodate different already existing values and needs which have already been articulated, but in its best instances, politics means the locus where new values and needs are articulated. And this is where imagination comes to the fore. Because, you know, as Ferare himself says, without imagination, nothing can pierce the armor of our collective representations. And this is a crucial point. Imagination makes us sensitive to the really qualitatively different ways of seeing the world, and qualitatively different arguments. It makes us sensitive to others' suffering as well. Otherwise, if we just relied on our procedures of argumentation, we might never be able to exit this armor of our collective representations. How do we actually sustain such a demanding form of, you know, reasoning and doing politics in the first place? It's not enough to just have institutional background, institutional foundations. What we need, Ferare is arguing, is a democratic ethos. A democratic ethos is a complex, you might use Habermas's expression, life world, a set of, you know, basic values and sentiments which animate our everyday action. And a democratic ethos has usually been interpreted along the lines of republican virtues, the passion for the common good, the passion for deliberation, the readiness to offer sacrifice, gift-giving, the readiness to accommodate diversity, and so on. But one important sentiment, Ferare argues, has not been incorporated into this traditional view of the democratic ethos, and that is a sentiment of openness, a sentiment of radical openness for experimentation, for meeting others' arguments halfway, for really kind of engaging with others substantively and not being afraid, not feeling threatened by other worldviews, by other comprehensive perspectives of the good, and of being prepared to experiment with new modes of consociation. And Ferare contrasts this sentiment of openness, which might be closest to Deweyan pragmatist perspective, for example, to some alternative conceptions which have been suggested, such as Derrida's view of generosity, hospitality, than Stephen White's view of presumptive generosity, or Charles Taylor's view of agape. These are these qualitatively new virtues which we must consider when thinking about the democratic ethos. However, we cannot just think of one democratic ethos. If we are to be politically liberal in a global sense, we need to start investigating whether the democratic ethos is really only compatible with one worldview, historically the Protestant Western one, or whether there can be an idea of multiple democratic ethoses, such as there are multiple modernities, for example. Ferare says if we have multiple modernities nowadays, if we have these perspectives which argue that there have been qualitatively different paths towards modernity, which are not necessarily convergent in the classical sense of the word, then we might also consider the idea that we have multiple intrinsic resources, multiple intrinsic foundations for the development of a democratic ethos across the civilizational lines, which means we can have certain intrinsic potential for democracy, for pluralism within Confucianism, within Judaism, within Islam, within other types of Christianity, and within many other secular worldviews apart from Western liberalism. But then, how do we really accommodate this hyperpluralism? It's really a challenging task, because even when we can imagine situations where even the conjectural reasoning, which I just mentioned before, doesn't work, where you can't even convince someone that there are intrinsic pluralist sensitivities within his or her own comprehensive conception. And then Professor Ferare suggests that doesn't require us, even that doesn't require us to regress to a mere modus vivendi. We can then resort to something called the multivariate democratic polity. And that means we can have a two-tiered political system where there is a majority of citizens who are able to reach a certain overlapping consensus through public deliberation, through conjecture, so through different kinds of arguing. And then there are those who still are not able to in a way, be incorporated into this overlapping consensus on any grounds, but they still must not be subjected to what Ferare calls liberal oppression, to perfectionist liberalism. They should be granted certain rights to practice their worldviews in everyday action, as long as this practice within the group of people who subscribe to this worldview, within this social group, does not contradict the constitutional essentials. So this is the highest point of political liberalism, the idea of the multivariate democratic polity, which Ferare then explores also on a global scale, because he realizes it is not really possible to tackle these inhospitable conditions in the context of one national state, in one polity, but we have to start thinking how to devise certain procedures of governance, not really government, but governance, which would be able to work slowly towards something that would resemble a global multivariate polity, or a society of peoples, as Rawls has defined it. So a society where we have not only liberal peoples, but also decent people, so peoples who do not share the liberal comprehensive conception, but who are nevertheless reasonable in the sense that they are prepared to bear the burden of judgment. And then we can't just impose liberal conception, then we have to engage them in a really open dialogue. So in this, I believe, are the keystones and the essential steps of Alesandra Ferare's reconstruction of political liberalism as a global democratic horizon. And now I would just like to present some following brief comments and questions, and invite Professor Ferare to perhaps elaborate a bit on some of the points. So I would start from the most general uncertainty that I have. So at one point, Ferare states that while agonist theories of democracy worry about the production of homogeneity by societal elites, political liberals worry about hyperplurality and how to accommodate it, and this is somehow a fundamental difference in their focus. And then I will now have a small quote by Ferare. The matter of emphasis comes down to the perceived urgency on the part of the agonists of safeguarding spaces for dissent, always at risk in a polity premised on the homogeneity that power and elites naturally tend to produce, and on the opposite urgency perceived by liberal Democrats of addressing and possibly reconciling differences that in a complex and culturally pluralistic society always tend to jeopardize whatever consensus the democratic process may, with difficulty and much effort, manage to achieve. From the agonistic perspective, cohesion is taken for granted and difference needs active protection. From the perspective defended here, it is the cohesion of the polity that needs being attended to in the face of always present centrifugal forces. But my question is this cohesion and is this plurality really of the same kind that the agonists and the liberals worry about? I think it seems to me that the agonists are much more worrying about the cohesion produced by practices of cultural hegemony and practices of ideology, which justifies a fundamentally unjust socioeconomic order, which fundamentally undermines the prospect of plurality, and not so much about what might be termed cultural cohesion. So my my question then is, can we really do without any degree of what we might call epistemological audacity or epistemological even arrogance of social diagnosis and critique if we want to investigate the ways towards strengthening and preserving the democratic project in the face of the inhospitable conditions that you have mentioned, but also the general inhospitable condition of capitalism, even in its previous forms? Or must we ignore completely the issue of ideology and cultural hegemony because of their problematic issues in terms of the epistemological privilege of the critic, of the social critic and the diagnostician? So do we ignore this thematic entirely for the right reasons? That would be my question. That relates to the issue of the relationship between epistemic humility and reflexivity. So Ferare grants in the chapter on truth, the last chapter, that even when adjudicating interparadigmatic questions, and my colleague here will go into much more detail regarding these issues, even when adjudicating these questions that should only relate to justification and to verification, we do in fact refer to the world out there. That means we determine that a certain paradigm, a certain complete vocabulary best frames the question itself that is at stake. So when saying that the question of secularism is best understood through the conception of the immanent frame in relation to the question, is the US less secular than France, we are really posing a question of truth, as I understand it. And then that leads me to the question, what is the relationship between public reason and theory? Because, as we already heard, there is no place for theory within the public reasoning. So the argument about the autonomy of politics implies that reasons that move the imagination in order to promote certain ends of action must not be articulated on the grounds of moral or theoretical statements, but then on what grounds can they possibly be articulated? So if we discard the Platonic cave metaphor as the paradigm of politics, this also means, in my opinion, that we have done away with an essentialist distinction between theory and common sense statements, everyday speech. And then the discussion within the cave itself, doesn't it also involve substantive statements about the good, the just, and the nature of social reality? And then doesn't this imply that our normative arguments in the deliberative arena have to draw upon comprehensive visions of the good society? And I would there include the socialist vision of the good society in light of my first question. So just to conclude with, how does political liberalism accommodate left anti-capitalism in light of all these problems, to use the broadest possible term? So if the realm of symbolic reproduction, what we might call the political realm in the narrower sense of the term, has the potential to be democratized along the lines of a multivariate democratic polity, could the same be said for the socio-economic order of contemporary capitalist societies? So what do I mean by this? I mean, can we imagine a multivariate economic order where groups of citizens who profess left anti-capitalism would be granted the right, for example, to practice planned economy within a broader market-based context? Now, this seems like a weird proposition, and when I wonder what does it say to us? So if the answer is negative, then what does that tell us about the actual limitations, the non-liberal and the ultimately oppressive nature of the market-based socioeconomic order, which doesn't allow for pluralism at the level of the social structuring? What does it tell us about the limits of purely symbolic political emancipation? And how strange or even unjust would be the fact that some, let's say, very religious people within the multivariate democratic polity would be granted certain rights to realize their worldviews in everyday life, whereas, let's say, socialists or left anti-capitalists would have no option but to fully integrate into the market-based social order if they wish to be citizens of a given polity. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, that's it. And I would now like to give the words to Jelena Lončar.
To participate in this seminar, and thank you to Professor Ferare for giving me the opportunity to engage more with his book. Marian basically explained clearly all the most important arguments from the book, so I won't talk too much about this. So basically in the context where democracy has shifted from being one among several forms of governance to being the one unquestionable legitimate form of government, Professor Ferare examines what it means for a political regime to count as a real democracy. And in the book, Professor Ferare mentions 10 inhospitable conditions for democracy. Marion mentioned some of them. I will mention here the third one, which is the hyperpluralism. That is the increased cultural pluralism of constituencies caused mainly by migrations or ethnic minorities in the country, which makes it difficult to reach a consensus on public values and constitutional essentials. Besides that, one of the consequences of this societal pluralism is that citizenship has become less inclusive and more selective. So, for example, immigrants, refugees, asylum seekers, etc., have all been excluded from citizenship rights. And in the next 10 to 15 minutes, I will address first two topics related to hyperpluralism in Professor Ferare's work, religion and multiculturalism, and then briefly say something about the consequences of the shift from government to governance. Okay. The idea of political pluralism is historically rooted in Western Protestant cultures, as we said. And Professor Ferare raises the following questions. Is the only true democratic spirit rooted in the spirit of radical Protestantism? Could there be more than one version of democracy and therefore democratic ethos? Can there be a form of democratization that does not amount to westernization? Can we have democracy in other non-Western cultures? And what should its content be? And he finds an answer by looking at different religions. In Buddhism, Hindu, Confucianism, Islam, Hebrew scripts, etc. What he aims to find out is if there is a convergence in values among these cultures that could basically be the basis of the democratic spirit, of the shared democratic spirit. And the reason why he turns to religious sources is because religion is an important part of people's identities. So asking how democratic societies should organize contentious relationship between religion and politics, Professor Ferare argues, and I quote, "The democracy has a chance of becoming a truly universal political form only if it truly opens city rather than consisting in the exploitation of Western institutions and traditional forms." Therefore, he offers an idea of multiple democracies as a way of dealing with the religious and cultural diversity. And he finds that democracy and religion are compatible because different cultures, Muslim, Hindu, Jewish, Confucian, comply with these main components of democratic ethos, of the spirit of democracy. And according to Professor Ferare, in the religious works, we can find that there is a cross-cultural convergence on several components of the spirit of democracy, and that's the orientation towards a common good. So in all of these works, we can find orientation towards a common good, acceptance of pluralism, consent as the ground of legitimate rule, orientation towards equality of citizens, and the positive appraisal of individuality. So all of these are the basis, the shared basis of democratic ethos. However, he finds that the priority of individual rights over duties and the role of political conflict within a democratic polity are the contested components of the democratic ethos. So there are cultures, for example, Muslim or Confucian, that prioritize duties over rights. And for these cultures, rights are only evoked as a restorative concept, only after harm has been inflicted. In these cultures, rights serve as basically as a ground for compensation, not the priority over duties. Okay. And second, there are some countries, well, for example, in liberal democracies, confrontation of interests and values is prioritized. It's understood as a sign of healthy democratic life. It's a good thing in public arena to contest, to confront different opinions, different interests. For some other countries, this is not the case. They have a fear of conflict. So they are suspicious of the divisive potential of confrontation, and they prioritize agreement to conflict. Okay, and having these differences in mind, Professor Ferare construes 4 versions of the spirit of democracy, or 4 versions of democracies. These 4 are the liberal democracies, strong republicanism, consociationalist democracies, and consensualist democracies, according to these differences in ethos. So the liberal democracies that can be found, for example, in the US or the UK, They combine the right-centered understanding of the democratic process and value contestation. Some other cultures combine value of contestation, but with a duty-centered approach. So they value duties to the rights and but also the conflicts, okay? And we can find them in the strong republicanism. Historically, there were Athens, Roman Republic, Venice, for example. Then the third model, the consociationalist democratic regimes that I mentioned, so for example, Belgium or Switzerland, they endorse and prize the priority of rights, but do so with a consociationalist bent and a strong aversion to democratic contestation. And finally, we have consensualist democratic cultures, which can be found in Asia, in Malaysia, Taiwan, or Thailand, that combine instinctive aversion to conflict and contestation with a propensity for the centrality of duties over rights, okay? So I would like to raise several issues related to consociationalist ethos, so both consociationalist democracies and consensualist democracies that have aversion towards conflict, okay? And I would like to invite all of us to discuss these issues after this presentation. So what I'm interested in is how does a consociationalist ethos relate to the objections against multiculturalism? Okay, in the sixth chapter, you mentioned several objections to multiculturalism. Can a democracy that adopts consociationalist ethos be defended from these criticisms? So one of the criticisms of multiculturalism is that it leads to essentialization of identity and separation of cultures. Okay. And for example, when Charles Taylor argues that respect for cultural membership is needed in supporting dignity and self-identity, he fails to recognize that identities and group differences are socially constructed, okay? Similarly, Professor Ferare argues that religion contributes to identity of individuals and groups. Religious affiliation defines who we are both individually and collectively, okay? So is it possible to acknowledge the intersubjective constitution of subjectivity at the same time and still emphasize the equal treatment of all citizens that requires us to pay due respect to the value of being rooted in one's own culture, as Professor Ferare says? Okay. So additionally, how do we pay due respect to the migrant cultures or cultures of national minorities in multicultural societies? So for example, to Islamic cultures in Germany or to the Chinese culture in the US, if they share different cultural values from the majority culture, do we need differentiated rights for these groups? Do we need them on the basis of cultural or structural arguments? So structural arguments sound more convincing to me, okay? So when I read the multiculturalists, we have the politics of recognition, politics of difference. Iris Young has different arguments for group rights than Charles Taylor or even Kimlicka. They don't base them on culture or identity, but on the oppression and discrimination. It is the justice. We need differentiated group rights in order to remedy oppression towards groups, and not based on the essentialization of identities, because we can have some individuals who do not obey to the culture, do not participate in the culture they are ascribed to, okay? And then if we do not need these differentiated rights, do these minority groups simply have to accept our procedures and values for prudential reasons? Okay. So for example, Brian Barry, who is a liberal, would, for example, ascribe to this, but then say maybe sometimes we need, in the case of, to remedy the oppressions. And then second, if protection of individual freedom requires protection and recognition of one's culture, as Professor Ferare argues, what implications does this argument have on the governance model we adopt? So for example, Kimlicka contends that national minorities require self-governance rights to be able to preserve their distinct culture. For the national minorities, he claims that they need self-governance rights in the form of federalism, territorial autonomy, or consociational democracy. However, all of these forms of governance may further embed ethnic or religious divisions and differences and entrench ethnic or religious cleavages. Besides that, intergroup relations or the rights of minorities within minorities remain contested in this type of governance. So is the right of exit, for example, to exit sufficient here, you mentioned, okay? Kratast, for example, would argue for this right. But what does the right to exit mean in case of ascriptive groups? Okay, one can argue that there is no exit from racial or ethnic groups. Others perceive individuals as members of certain racial, ethnic, or gender groups based on their appearance, their name, or skin color. Okay. So then there's the right to voice, proposed by Anne Phillips, but this one may not be sufficient remedy in cases of consensualist democracies, in cases where we prioritize duties over rights and have a strong aversion towards conflict. Okay. So these were the questions related to multiculturalism and religion. And finally, I would like, my final question relates to the implications of the shift from government to governance, okay? And something I'm interested in as well. Professor Ferare mentions that one of the inhospitable conditions for democracy is the verticalization of social and political relations. Marian also mentioned this inhospitable condition. There is a greater emphasis on recognizability, discretionality, and ultimately the power of the political leader, CEO, or any form of head of the institution. In the global state, there is no time for deliberation, consultations. Leaders are expected to react immediately and discretionally. Okay, and decision making is further complicated by the global governance system that also adds more. A single vote in elections basically has never meant less today, right? So what Professor Ferare suggests as a way of reconciling governance and democratic legitimacy is deliberative democracy instead of the competitive elitist one. And I will quote Professor Ferare when he says that structures of governance that coordinate political actions via soft law, best practices, benchmarking, and moral suasion do not necessarily generate democratic deficit, which is important in this global governance system, if and only if, first, they respect those constitutional essentials to which free and equal citizens have consented in referenda, or in more indirect way, but still recognizable ways. Or second, some forms of accountability of those who coordinate political action while governance remains in place. So they need to accept the basic constitutional essentials, and we still need some form of accountability. Okay, and I would like to raise the issue of accountability here. So what makes it possible to tell when deliberative democracy is responsive to those affected by the decision and when it is merely a device of manipulation and elite domination? How should we theorize and normatively assess those individual and collective actors who claim to represent others for political purposes, but do so without the electoral authorization and accountability, usually thought to be at the heart of democratic representation? So some authors propose discursive accountability instead of the traditional promissory responsiveness. Others propose anticipatory responsiveness. Okay. So others say that if there is no public disagreement of those who are affected by a decision, then the decision is legitimate and accepted. But again, how does this work in cultures that have aversion to conflict, in which we don't have a strong public voice of citizens? And how can we reconcile this with the normative understanding of democracy you want to cover in this book? Okay, so, thank you, and that will be it for me.
And now we'll hear the commentary of Bojana Simeunovic.
Well, thank you, Marian.
Also from the Institute.
Thank you, Professor Ferare, for allowing us to comment on your book for this opportunity. So, coming from the perspective of international relations, I find it most appealing, as well as relevant, to focus upon something that my colleague also mentioned, this shift from governance to government, and particularly a chapter titled Beyond the Nation, Governance in Deliberative Democracy. So this chapter addresses the challenges of understanding democracy and implementing democracy on a level above the nation state. So what I wish to discuss with you today relates to potential difficulties that could arise when translating some of the theoretical concepts proposed into policymaking. To start off with, I would like to revisit the transformative character of democracy. As the author explains in the book, democracy has already adapted itself in the past, namely, it was transformed from direct to representational due to the growth of the electorate. So a second transformation has been under its way for some time now, and that is the adaptation of democracy to the above national context, or the above national level. The second transformation is the main topic of the chapter I'm focusing on. It discusses the possibility of a global pluralistic rule of law without the establishment of anything that would in any case resemble the world government, understood as a state-like institutional center. So the book offers the following as the key to understanding democracy at the above national level. So using the tools of governance instead of government, while readapting the standards of democracy to the above national level by moving from a competitive to a deliberative way of engaging in political life. So let me first outline differences between governance and government as explained in the book. Governance is, and I quote now, the coordination of complex networks of action over extended periods of time in the absence of a structure of authority endowed with the capacity to impose sanctions that are in the end backed up by force, end of quote. So there's no formal subordination of the participants' autonomy. Tools of governance include soft laws, the open method of coordination, steering the interaction of a plurality of actors through best practices, benchmarking, and moral suasion. Global governance, for that matter, simply means adding the global character to it. So defining terms of the processes and actors at the above national level. So in short, this means coordination and orientation without ruling. So to clarify the point further, it is wrong to analyze democracy at the above national level through the lenses of democracy as we conceive of it at the national level. Why? Well, such practice inevitably leads us into imputing the new forms of governance a lack. So a deficit in sort of a basic sense that there is no demos at the international level, at least not one comparable to the one at the national. So now, as it is demonstrated in the book, the problem of democratic deficit at the above national level persists only if we commit the mistake explained above. So with the change of perspective, the problem basically evades. So let's leave this for now and come back to it later with some questions I'd like to discuss later. But then let me move on to explaining the understanding of the conceptions of deliberative and competitive democracy and how explaining how they differ. Deliberative democracy stands in opposition to this largely mainstream notion of democracy. Its distinctive characters are the presence of an object of deliberation, the presence of a deliberating body, and the existence of a deliberating process. So now some of the major differences as they're outlined in the book. First, in the competitive model of democracy, politicians compete on the electoral market. They propose platforms and policies. I quote, that in their opinion meets the interests and the values and preferences of the voters. And voters in turn then rewards appropriate policy proposals by voting for their proponents. On the other hand, deliberative democracy involves engagement in a public discussion to deliberate upon the policies and measures that best reflect the general interest of the common good. Now, second, competitive model functions on the basis of supply and demand, as Dr. Ferare explains. We have a collection of voters. They base their preferences, they're differently distributed across the population, and they create a political demand to which the various segments of the political elite or the parties respond by supplying some policy proposals and general platforms that are usually doomed to failure or destined to meet very diverse degrees of acceptance, as Dr. Ferare explains. Now again, the deliberative democracy, or the deliberative component of democracy, indicates a different understanding of political life. So one of a dialogue among citizens that takes place within a previously established institutional framework and in the public sphere as well, such as media. And this dialogue then becomes, I quote, an anonymous flow of communication within a public sphere that, if vital and vibrant, resists being reduced to an audience, but rather functions as a filter that selects the most valid or less faulty reasons. No problem, okay. Let's wait until we fix this.
They have a visit to it doesn't matter.
Shall I continue?
I think yes. I think
yeah? Okay.
No problem. He'll bring the paper. Sorry, really sorry. So the effect of this week of like real.
So, the end goal is meeting good reasons upon which a priority of a certain end is decided. And finally, during the deliberative process, conclusions are arrived at together through the coercion-free exchange of reasons in favor or against some proposal put forward in the public sphere. I quote, and not reached in foro interno, only to be subsequently checked for their compatibility with the existing reasonable, comprehensive conceptions of the good. So this is when we come to the center of the argument, as I understood it. To account for democracy at the above national level, we must think of it in terms of governance in combination with deliberative democracy. Now, the author wonders in the book, what could be the potential tension in combining these two concepts? And he suggests that one major point of friction could be the legislative authorship of citizens. We briefly mentioned this yesterday. So what does this mean? Well, it is a commonly attributed characteristic of any type of democracy that the citizens are the creators of the law that they obey. Well, yet, in practice, this is seldom the case, in the sense that nowhere in the world are citizens ultimately the authors of the laws. In fact, they're rarely in position to influence the lawmaking process directly. So rather, as the author argues, by drawing on the tradition of dualistic constitutionalism, citizens are to be considered equal and free subscribers to the Constitution, and such consent secures the legitimacy of other actions of lawmaking that may follow at a different level through various bureaucratic channels. We have parliaments legally influenced by lobbies, interest groups, as well as structures of governance at the global level and other sources of regulation. So just quickly, this concept of dualistic constitutionalism, coined by Bruce Ackerman, to explain the uniqueness of American constitutionalism, underlines the presence of dualistic democracy as embedded in the US Constitution. So this dualism that Ackerman identifies is that between normal politics on the one hand and constitutional moments or the periods of high lawmaking on the other. So by consenting to the Constitution, citizens basically agreed to a bipartition of legislative authorship explained above. Now the major question emerges, and that is how we can make sense of the legislative authorship of citizens when governance replaces representative government at the above national level. Does that mean less democracy? This is one of the major questions in the chapter. So if we apply these implications of dual constitutionalism to the above national, hence global level, the author arrives at the following conclusion. Now I quote. Structures and methods of governance do not necessarily subtract anything from the democratic quality of the European Union or other supranational political arenas, if and only if, and my colleague also quoted this, they take place within the boundaries of constitutional essentials that meet with the consent of free and equal citizens, as manifested in referenda or in more indirect but still recognizable ways, and some recognizable form of accountability remains in place. And this is the concepts from these theses is what I would like to now focus on and raise some questions. So the first, constitutional essentials. Could there ever exist something like that at the global level? Namely, do the interests of various participants at the global scene coincide at the level of reaching the universal essentials required? How is the process of reaching a consensus through deliberation facilitated at the global level? Furthermore, how is it ensured that the deliberation process gives birth to good reasons for proposing certain ends? So there's always a possibility that a consensus is not arrived at, and politics, it seems, leaves no room for a decision not to be made. So in that sense, politics seems robust, and how do we reconcile these two? Now, to put things into perspective, to speak of examples of the United Nations and the European Union, at present time, we can talk about the Charter of the United Nations, but it seems that this cannot be considered the constitution of the world or anything alike. In the context of the EU, we can certainly talk about essentials embodied in previously constitutional treaty and its successor, the Lisbon Treaty. However, can we really consider any of these to be the sort of the Peoples of Europe Constitution or anything like that? These remain intergovernmental agreements about how the politics at the European level should function, agreements about priorities and values that still favor state sovereignty and self-interest of its signatory parties, at least in terms of security and foreign policy areas, and to a certain degree in economic matters as well. So moreover, I would like to hear how dualistic constitutionalism mirrors the EU political reality, or even if we speak solely in terms of how it ought to be or how it should be, meaning there is some combination of governance and deliberative democracy with a form of dualistic constitutionalism at the EU level. What kind of future do we envision for the European Union? Is that a post-national or a supranational? So do we overcome national, or do we have some sort of a sui generis European Union with the national remaining to a certain degree? Now finally, isn't that the implementation of some form of dualistic constitutionalism implies a form of authority endowed with the capacity to impose direct sanctions in order to ensure that certain constitutional essentials previously agreed upon are being properly upheld. And then two other points from the thesis. We have referenda, or some recognized, or more indirect but still recognizable ways. So I would like to hear more elaboration on this. What do you what is meant by these more indirect but still recognizable ways? And finally, recognizable by whom? So now we come to the point of accountability, meaning what is meant by some recognizable form of accountability. Now, to stay with this concept of accountability and the concept that accompanies its legitimacy, the book suggests that the capacity of global governance to orient and coordinate the actions must rest in something. Well, precisely, it rests in the monopoly and the attribution of legitimacy. What this means is that, I quote, only the coordinating agency can legitimate the actions of coordinated participants. Well, the book takes the UN Security Council to explain the functioning of this concept. Well, the Article 2.4 of the Charter of the United Nations bans the use of force, or even the possibility of using it as a threat to warn off potential aggressors. Except in cases of self-defense, a state can resort to the use of force only in compliance with the resolution of the Security Council. So thus the Security Council can be said to have the monopoly over the attribution of legitimacy to use force with relation to each member state. Now, without going into any examples of states not abiding to these rules and violating international law, because we all know that that was and has been the case, I would like to point at, in my understanding, a more substantial question about the structure of international institutions. Namely, it seems that the structure in which these institutions are organized directly influences the way in which they function. Meaning we must not forget who sits in the Security Council, and that each of these powerful states has a veto over every decision brought to the floor. So as structure directly shapes procedure, not solely, but with great significance, I find that parallel with reforming the procedures of decision-making to become more democratic and so forth at the above national level, we must find a way to create and recreate international institutions in order for them to become more egalitarian and more just at last, let's say. So I guess my question would be, how should these established structures of these institutions be changed so that they account for an overall increase of democracy through the use of governance instruments? On what basis should these, as we talked about them earlier, coordinating agencies be established, and how? So according to the definition of the Commission on Global Governance, actors in the global governance policy and decision-making are, of course, governments, but also various non-governmental organizations, citizens' movements, multinational corporations, and the public and the global capital market. So all these actors seem to enter the bargaining process with some previously defined interests and they reshape them through the interaction with other participants. But when they do come up with a policy, this group, when they come up with a policy, the execution of it still remains in the hands of nation states and their willingness to direct their resources to the use of international bodies. Well, now, the rise of multinational corporations whose power exceeds the boundaries of nation states brings a different dynamic to the international game. So the question that arises is how to control the growth of these profit-oriented, self-interested international corporations using the tools of governance when no direct sanctioning is involved. So do we envision that being handled by global governance at all? Moreover, what about issues of let's say, international security, military interventionism, the maintenance of war level? How adequate are the soft tools of governance when coping with such issues? Should this domain of political and economic remain in the hands of nation states, or shall a global pluralistic rule of law account for these as well? And in what way? So it seems that with no authority that could impose direct sanctions against the violators and free riders, how would that be possible? That's what I would like to discuss later on. And finally, what is the motivation? Like, why would nation states relinquish their sovereignty and power to the coordinating bodies, pluralistic and cosmopolitan, in cases when their interests do not meet with the common interest of the group? So finally, and I close with this, I would like to address something that hasn't been the subject of the chapter directly, but I find it important when discussing the potential rule of a global pluralistic law, and that is sovereignty. So to go back to the classical international relations realist, Morgenthau, he would ask, is sovereignty divisible? So, and his reply to the question goes like this, and I quote, "Sovereignty signifies supreme law-giving. In other words, that authority within the state is sovereign, which, in case of dissension among the different law-making factors, has the responsibility for making the final binding decision, and which, in crises of law enforcement, such as revolution or civil war, has the ultimate responsibility for enforcing the laws of the land. That responsibility must rest somewhere or nowhere, but it cannot be here and there at the same time. The belief in the divisible sovereignty is the ideological manifestation of this contradiction between political reality and political preference. The doctrine makes it intellectually feasible to reconcile not what logic proves to be incompatible, to give up sovereignty while retaining it, but also what experience shows to be irreconcilable under the conditions of modern civilizations. So, in my opinion, this poses major problem to the effective functioning of international institutions and global governance for that matter still. And how do we overcome this? And do we? Thank you for your attention.
Speaker is Srđan from the Institute.
Okay, so thank you, Professor Ferrara, for the opportunity to debate some issues with you, which are quite interesting. I will have a short presentation regarding the last chapter of your book, although I will mention some other parts of the book that are connected with the issues that are raised in the last part. So I think that Ferrara's theoretical attempt to reconstruct democracy and liberalism is important in two ways. Firstly, as Marian and other colleagues have said, he acknowledges the fact that modern democracy needs to be rearticulated on a non-metaphysical ground so it could rise to the challenges of globalization. For instance, global migrations, financial turn in capitalism, terrorism, etc. According to Ferrara, this is the crucial shift we need to have if we wish to have a politics at its best. That is, the kind of politics where, and this is a quote, the articulation of reasons moves the imagination. A second and somewhat unusual, and I mean unusual in the best sense of the word, implication of Ferrara's book is that this much needed reconstruction can be done only if we simultaneously reform both the vocabulary of social and political theory and also epistemology. And it is this second implication that I want to focus on in this short discussion. Right from the outset of Ferrara's book, we can see the political stake of epistemology. Namely, his main idea is to reform Rawls' notion of overlapping causes, but merging it with the moral consequences of our disposition to see, to have in our mind the openness towards the otherness that is exemplified in Taylor's understanding of agape, Derrida's view on hospitality, and White's notion of presumptive generosity. What all of these articulations of absolute openness to the other have in common is the fact that they cannot be derived from a universal moral principle or be known from a universal moral principle. Nor can they be uniformly applied in a coherent way on every single instance of moral dispute. In other words, our ability to be open towards the other is particularistic. It's a kind of disposition dependent on contingent reasons that can derive from everyday life, that are derived from everyday life. In that sense, according to Ferrara, this kind of openness can operate only on the exemplary level. And this is the famous case of Achilles and Priam that suspends their mutual animosity during the war. And this openness fosters a temporary, focused, and concrete normative framework that in turn stimulates a more general moral reflection and enables us to have some kind of moral and institutional experimentation. As Ferrara eloquently articulates this point on page 65, the philosophical import of the passion for openness is that such notion creates a link, a family resemblance between an interpretive and suggestive openness of the work of art, the existential openness of a creative life course, the openness of a form of social life, and the openness of a political order to reform and to critique. In all these cases, we can understand openness as the property of those elements that set the imagination in motion, create a space of possibilities, allow for the space of reasons and of judgment to work and constitute a standard for political desirability. However, behind this underlying optimism of the idea of openness and imagination lurks a common problem that most non-metaphysical theories, and you make that distinction between non-metaphysical and anti-metaphysical theories face. Namely, Ferrara thinks that without any kind of robust theoretical bulwark, intrinsically non-democratic ideologies could endanger societies that are guided by their passion for openness. And this is the main reason why Ferrara holds that we need some sort of correspondence theory of truth that operates at some level if we are to have a viable democratic way of dealing with what he calls hyperpluralism. On the other side, we also need a non-realist epistemology if we are to avoid a pitfall of grinding our cultural values on our own society in some metaphysical warranted normative realm. Here, Ferrara introduces his dual theory of truth. The main distinction here is between intra-paradigmatic statements that are positioned within one uncontroversial frame of reference where truth could be empirically verified using the notions present in the framework itself. For example, it's raining today in Belgrade. And inter-paradigmatic statements in which agreement on truth value of each statement of a particular paradigm it could be contested. And agreement is attainable only across paradigm borders. And these epistemological insights that are intrinsically connected with Ferrara's political outtake of liberalism raise some interesting questions and issues. For instance, Ferrara insists that intra- and inter-paradigmatic truth operates on two completely distinct levels. But then this brings the issue of how can we verify those inter-paradigmatic truths. He does say this in defense of his position. When we argue about the appropriateness of entire conceptual framework or paradigms, we look at the world for setting our controversies. We compare these paradigms in terms of their fruitfulness for organizing our exchanges with the natural and social world in ways that favor our flourishing. This is on page 203. And now we see that this is a very pragmatic outtake on this problem. But this term flourishing, it's vague also, and it needs to be articulated in some, and this is my question, articulated in some concrete way if it's to be a validity test of any sort. To put this problem in Rortian terms, we never just dispute about idiosyncratic vocabularies, which is there's those interparadigmatic truths, without having in mind and focusing on effects these new vocabularies would have on final vocabularies, which is the common sense, as Marian said, common sense knowledge of everyday life. And this also brings the larger question that I would like to hear your response to, is the problem of intersubjectivity, namely on which paradigm statements is intersubjectivity based on your opinion. And finally, and I will be short because yeah, we need to finish, I have a concrete example, although you did this answer it today on lunch, but I think the audience needs to hear it also. How can we explain some kind of hybrid discourses where we have interparadigmatic truths connected together? So we have, for instance, creationism, and where we have a metaphysical framework forcefully applied on empirical evidence of biological evolution. Should we be generous and hospitable towards this kind of framework only because it has some kind of political significance in the US at least? So these are the main issues I wanted to raise, and thank you.